The dazzle paint still clings to her hull in patches, white with broad green stripes and red crosses, the international promise of mercy at sea. Olympic-class vessel number 401 lies 400 feet down in the Aegean, her bow buried in silt, her stern torn open like a mouth mid-scream. The portholes gape. Inside, hospital beds rust in rows. Surgical instruments scatter across tilted floors. A ship built to carry 2,400 passengers in gilded luxury now holds the bones of 30 souls who couldn't escape the churning propellers. She took 55 minutes to die, 3 times faster than her more famous sister. The mine exploded at 8:15 a.m. on November 21, 1916. By 9:07, she was gone. Britannic never carried a single paying passenger. She was the largest, the safest, the most improved of the 3 Olympic-class liners. Did the ship fail, or did she fulfill exactly the purpose she was always meant to serve? In August 1996, a maritime historian named Simon Mills wrote a check and became the owner of a corpse. The price wasn't disclosed publicly, but the Britannic wreck came with conditions. Leave it as it is. Disturb nothing. Let the dead rest. Mills agreed. He'd been obsessed with the ship since childhood, drawn not to Titanic's glamour, but to Britannic's obscurity. The forgotten sister, the one that almost worked. For 20 years, he funded expeditions, commissioned surveys, and protected the site from looters. In interviews, he spoke of the wreck with the tenderness of a curator handling glass. She was meant to be the safest ship afloat, he said once, his voice carrying that peculiar English formality that masks grief as fact. But ownership of a sunken hospital ship raises questions that have no good answers. Who owns the disaster? Can you purchase the right to a mass grave? Mills never salvaged artifacts, never sold souvenirs. But his divers swam through wards where nurses drowned, past the lifeboat davits that crushed passengers against the hull. The Greek government permits it. International maritime law permits it. The families of the dead, most of them, are gone. In November 2025, for the first time in 109 years, divers brought objects up from the wreck. Not bodies, not personal effects, mechanical components. Pieces of the ship itself, approved by Mills, sanctioned by authorities, destined for museum display. The Smithsonian covered it. Heritage organizations celebrated. No one interviewed the relatives of Nurse Millicent Pitt, age 23, who went down with the ship. No one asked Archie Jewell's descendants, the lookout who survived both Titanic and Britannic, only to die when a German torpedo sank the SS Donegal 2 years later. The objects came up clean, preserved by cold water, catalogued by professionals, destined for climate-controlled cases where tourists would photograph them beside the gift shop. This is how history happens, first as tragedy, then as scholarship, finally as tchotchkes. But Britannic's story begins long before the mine, before the war, before the ship even had a name. It begins in 1907, when the White Star Line faced a problem it couldn't outspend. Cunard was faster. The numbers were brutal. Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania crossed the Atlantic at 25 knots, shattering records, capturing headlines, stealing passengers. White Star's aging fleet, Celtic, Oceanic, Majestic, could barely manage 20. Speed meant prestige, prestige meant profit. The math was simple and humiliating. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star, was not a man who accepted humiliation gracefully. Thin, immaculately dressed, educated at Harrow, he carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who knew his family name opened doors but couldn't keep them from slamming shut. His father, Thomas Ismay, had built White Star from wreckage, literally purchasing the defunct company in 1867 and transforming it into Britain's premier luxury line. Bruce inherited the company in 1899 and immediately set about proving he could match his father's legacy. By 1907, Ismay understood that Cunard's speed couldn't be matched. German shipyards could build 25-knot liners. British yards could too, at extraordinary cost, burning coal at rates that made profitable operation nearly impossible. White Star couldn't win the speed race, so Ismay proposed a different competition: size, luxury, reliability. If they couldn't be fastest, they'd be grandest. On July 29, 1908, Ismay met with Lord Peary, chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast. What transpired exists only in corporate memory and contradictory accounts. No transcript survives. But the outcome was documented. 2 letters of agreement, signed July 31st, commissioning 2 ships of unprecedented scale. The first ship, later named Olympic, received yard number 400. The second, Titanic, got 401. The third wasn't yet planned. It would only be ordered if the first 2 succeeded. Construction began December 16, 1908, with Olympic's keel laying, and immediately the costs began accumulating in ways no one had predicted. To accommodate the ship's unprecedented size, Harland and Wolff demolished 3 existing slipways and built 2 massive gantries, each over 220 feet high, equipped with cranes capable of lifting 200 tons. The gantries alone cost $30,000, a figure that didn't appear in the original estimates presented to Ismay. The shipyard employed 15,000 men. Most lived in Belfast's cramped Catholic neighborhoods, walking to work before dawn, returning after dark. Skilled workers earned $2 per week. Laborers made less. The work was lethal. Men fell from scaffolding. Rivets, heated to 1,000 degrees, caused burns. Heavy machinery crushed limbs. During Olympic's construction, 8 deaths were officially recorded at Harland and Wolff. The true number was likely higher. Minor injuries went unrecorded, and workers who died at home from infection or trauma didn't make the official tally. No memorial exists for these men. Their names weren't engraved on plaques, weren't read at ceremonies. They were line items in payroll ledgers, interchangeable labor units, expendable components of industrial progress. The contracts White Star signed were peculiar. Cost-plus pricing. Harland and Wolff would bill for construction expenses plus 5% profit, with no fixed price cap. This wasn't standard practice. It transferred all financial risk to White Star while guaranteeing Harland and Wolff's profit, regardless of overruns. But the arrangement reflected a deeper reality. Harland and Wolff had built every White Star vessel since 1871. The relationship wasn't merely commercial, it was dynastic. Lord Peary oversaw construction. His nephew, Thomas Andrews, designed the ships. Ismay approved every detail. The 3 men formed a closed loop of ambition, each dependent on the other's success, none willing to acknowledge the precariousness of the arrangement. Olympic was launched October 20, 1910. 20,000 spectators watched as the hull, 20,600 tons of unpainted steel, slid down slipway number 2 on a layer of soap and tallow, entering the water in 62 seconds. The crowd cheered. Photographers captured the moment. Officials gave speeches about British engineering supremacy. No one mentioned that the ship was unfinished, just a hollow hull requiring another 7 months of work. Or that Titanic, under construction on the adjacent slipway, was already being modified with improvements based on Olympic's design flaws discovered during construction. Or that a third ship was being planned, larger still, designed to correct whatever mistakes the first 2 revealed. The Olympic class wasn't a triumph of completed design. It was iterative engineering: build, test, break, rebuild. Each ship was a prototype for the next. This approach works for automobiles. For vessels carrying 2,400 souls across the North Atlantic, the margin for error was thinner than Ismay cared to admit. Olympic entered service June 14, 1911, commanded by Captain Edward Smith. The maiden voyage was a publicity triumph. Newspapers praised her luxury: Turkish baths, swimming pool, a la carte restaurant, elevators, gymnasium. First-class passengers paid $30 for the crossing. Steerage passengers paid $8. Each crossing cost approximately $11,000 in operational expenses, coal, wages, port fees, maintenance. The ship needed to generate at least $16,000 per voyage to justify her existence. For 3 months, she met those targets. Then, on September 20th, 1911, during her 5th commercial voyage, Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in the Solent. The incident occurred at 12:46 p.m. in calm weather. HMS Hawke's bow struck Olympic's starboard side, tearing 2 gashes. The subsequent inquiry blamed Olympic. Suction from her enormous hull had pulled Hawke into collision, an effect no one had predicted because no ship that size had previously existed. The ruling meant White Star, not the Admiralty, would pay for repairs. Insurance covered Hawke. It didn't cover Olympic. The repairs took 6 weeks and required pulling workers from Titanic's construction. This delayed Titanic's maiden voyage from March 20th to April 10th, 1912. The delay would later be described as fate, providence, cruel timing. It was none of those things. It was cost plus contracting playing out exactly as written. Harland and Wolff had no incentive to maintain separate crews. White Star bore the cost. The workers did what they were told. 3 months later, Olympic lost a propeller blade mid-Atlantic. Again she returned to Belfast. Again workers were pulled from Titanic. Again Titanic's completion was delayed. The two sisters met in Belfast for the last time on March 4th, 1912. Olympic scarred and operational, Titanic pristine and untested. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, 4 days into her maiden voyage, Titanic struck an iceberg 400 miles south of Newfoundland. The ship had received 6 ice warnings that day. Captain Edward Smith, the same man who'd commanded Olympic's maiden voyage, acknowledged them but didn't reduce speed. This wasn't recklessness. It was standard practice. North Atlantic liners maintained speed through ice fields as routine procedure. Slowing down meant delays, missed connections, dissatisfied passengers. The White Star Line's reputation depended on punctuality. Smith had 40 years of experience and had never lost a ship. The lookouts had eyes. The night was clear. The system worked until it didn't. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who spotted the iceberg, later testified that he had no binoculars. They'd been locked in a cabinet, and the officer with the key had been reassigned during a last-minute crew shuffle in Southampton. Fleet saw the berg with his naked eyes at 500 yards. At 22 knots, Titanic covered that distance in 37 seconds. First Officer William Murdoch ordered hard to starboard, full reverse. The ship began to turn, not fast enough. The iceberg scraped along Titanic's starboard side for 10 seconds, buckling hull plates across 6 watertight compartments. Passengers felt a slight shudder. Some went to investigate. Most returned to bed. In the boiler rooms, water poured through gaps in the hull. Stokers scrambled up ladders as seawater flooded their workspace. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, inspected the damage and delivered his assessment to Captain Smith. Titanic could survive 4 flooded compartments. She had 6. She would sink in 2 hours, perhaps less. The lifeboats could hold 1,178 people. There were 2,224 aboard. This wasn't negligence, it was compliance. British Board of Trade regulations, written in 1896, required lifeboats based on tonnage, not passenger capacity. Titanic exceeded the legal requirement. She carried 4 more boats than the law demanded. The regulations hadn't been updated in 16 years because no one imagined ships would grow this large or that all the boats would ever be needed. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. Olympic, 500 miles away under Captain Herbert Haddock's command, received Titanic's distress calls at 12:25 a.m. Haddock calculated arrival time 10 hours minimum. Titanic had 2, perhaps 3. Olympic held course for New York. At dawn, Carpathia radioed that she'd rescued 705 survivors. Olympic requested permission to rendezvous and take them aboard. Carpathia's captain declined. The survivors couldn't endure being transferred to Titanic's identical sister. By 2:20 a.m., Titanic was gone. Approximately 1,500 people died, drowned, frozen, or crushed as the ship broke apart. The wireless operators kept transmitting until water reached their equipment. The musicians kept playing until the deck tilted too steeply to stand. The engineers stayed below, maintaining power and pumps, ensuring the lights stayed on so passengers could see to reach the boats. None of the engineers survived. Their bodies were never recovered. In the inquiries that followed, American, British, conducted with theatrical solemnity and political urgency, the questions multiplied, but the answers remained unsatisfying. Why no binoculars? Why full speed through ice? Why so few lifeboats? Why didn't nearby ships respond faster? Each question received a technical answer that explained nothing. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. The system had worked exactly as designed until the moment it catastrophically failed. Ismay, who'd survived by boarding a lifeboat during the final loading, was destroyed by the press. He was called a coward, a deserter, a man who prioritized his own survival over women and children. The accusations weren't entirely fair. He'd helped load boats for 90 minutes before stepping into one that was being lowered half empty. But fairness didn't matter. Someone had to be blamed, and the chairman of the company was convenient. Ismay retreated from public life, resigned from White Star in 1913, and spent the rest of his life trying to explain decisions made in 37 seconds. Captain Smith went down with his ship as tradition demanded. Thomas Andrews was last seen in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, his lifebelt discarded on a nearby table. Both men became martyrs. The 1,500 dead became statistics. The 705 survivors became witnesses to a tragedy that shouldn't have happened, but did. And in Belfast, on a slipway where Olympic's keel had been laid 4 years earlier, a third ship, larger, safer, redesigned with Titanic's lessons literally welded into her hull, was nearing completion. Construction on the third Olympic-class liner had begun November 30th, 1911, 4 months before Titanic sank, with the laying of her keel on the same slipway Olympic had occupied. She was originally called Gigantic, according to some newspaper reports and promotional materials from late 1911. Other sources claim the name was never officially assigned, that Gigantic was speculation by journalists eager to predict White Star's next grand vessel. The confusion is telling. Even the ship's identity was uncertain, conditional, waiting to see what her sisters would become. After Titanic sank, the name was quietly changed. Gigantic sounded like hubris. The company needed something that implied strength without boastfulness. They chose Britannic. When Titanic went down in April 1912, Britannic was barely 5 months into construction, just a skeleton of frames and keel plates, nowhere near launch. Work stopped. Not officially, not completely, but the pace slowed as engineers and naval architects reassessed everything. Thomas Andrews was dead. Lord Pirrie was publicly defending Harland and Wolff's construction standards before parliamentary inquiries. The men left in charge were competent but cautious, terrified of repeating mistakes they hadn't yet identified. The British Board of Trade inquiry into Titanic's sinking concluded in July 1912. The recommendations were extensive: more lifeboats, higher watertight bulkheads, better wireless protocols, improved crew training. Most were suggestions. Some were mandated. White Star implemented all of them on Britannic, plus modifications of their own. The ship's beam was increased from 92 feet to 94 feet, allowing a double hull along the entire length of the engine and boiler rooms. 6 of the watertight bulkheads were raised from E deck to B deck. The davits were redesigned to launch lifeboats more quickly. The total lifeboat capacity was increased to accommodate 3,600 people, more than the ship could carry. These modifications cost money no one had budgeted. White Star's insurance payout for Titanic was $1 million. The ship had cost $1.5 million to build and outfit. The company lost $500,000 on the disaster, plus immeasurable damage to its reputation. Britannic's modifications added another $250,000 to her construction costs. The accountants calculated break-even scenarios. Britannic would need to operate profitably for 15 years just to recoup her expenses. That assumed full passenger loads, no major incidents, stable economic conditions, and continued demand for transatlantic luxury travel. None of those assumptions would prove accurate. Britannic was launched February 26, 1914. The ceremony was subdued compared to Olympics launch. Fewer spectators, no brass bands. Ismay didn't attend. He'd already resigned from White Star. Lord Peary gave a brief speech emphasizing safety improvements without mentioning Titanic by name. The ship slid into the water at 11:15 a.m., painted white for the photographers, essentially an empty shell requiring another year of fitting out. She was slightly larger than her sisters, 882 feet long, 48,158 gross tons compared to Titanic's 46,228. She had more powerful engines, a larger rudder, improved ventilation systems. The first-class accommodations were designed to be more luxurious than anything afloat. A children's playroom was added to attract family travelers. The dining saloon featured a pipe organ. Every detail had been refined, upgraded, made safer and grander. But while Britannic was being fitted out in Belfast, Europe was mobilizing for war. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. 5 weeks later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia and France. Britain declared war on Germany. By August 4, 1914, the continent was engulfed. The British government began requisitioning ships for troop transport, hospital service, supply runs. Cunard's Lusitania and Mauretania continued limited passenger service. White Star's Olympic did the same, civilian crossings with reduced capacity, modified routes to avoid submarine zones. Britannic sat in Belfast, 80% complete, waiting for upholstery, artwork, china, linens. White Star had ordered the finest materials, teak decks, mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, Turkish carpets. Most of these items were now impossible to obtain. Luxury goods factories had converted to war production. Shipping was disrupted. Even if materials could be sourced, passenger demand had evaporated. Transatlantic travel plummeted. People weren't taking pleasure cruises while nations burned. White Star considered its options. Complete Britannic as designed and hope the war ended quickly? Convert her to military use immediately? Lay her up unfinished until conditions improved? Each choice lost money. The company chose the option that seemed patriotic and postponed immediate decisions. They offered Britannic to the Admiralty. The Admiralty declined. Britain already had sufficient hospital ships. Britannic sat in Belfast through all of 1914 into 1915, accumulating costs, insurance, security, maintenance, dock fees, while generating no revenue. Her engines had never run under load. Her lifeboats had never been tested with passengers. She was the most advanced ocean liner in the world, and also completely useless. In November 1915, the Admiralty changed its mind. Casualties from Gallipoli were overwhelming the existing hospital capacity. They needed more ships, larger ships, ships capable of carrying 1,000 wounded men from Mediterranean battlefields back to Britain. Britannic, empty and available, was perfect. The requisition was finalized December 13, 1915. Britannic would be completed not as a luxury liner, but as His Majesty's Hospital Ship Britannic, HMHS Britannic. White Star would be compensated for use of the vessel at a rate to be determined later. The company agreed. What choice did they have? HMHS Britannic completed her conversion in December 1915, painted white with a green horizontal stripe and large red crosses on her hull and funnels, the international symbols of medical neutrality guaranteed by the Hague Convention of 1907. The treaty stipulated that hospital ships were immune from attack. They could not carry weapons, military cargo, or troops. They existed solely for medical purposes and were to be respected by all belligerents. Germany had signed the convention. Britain had signed it. Everyone agreed hospital ships were sacred. This agreement would prove optimistic. Britannic's interior was stripped of luxury and refitted for function. The Turkish baths became storage for medical supplies. The swimming pool was drained and covered. The grand staircase remained, but the first-class lounges were converted to operating theaters and recovery wards. The ship could accommodate 3,309 patients in addition to her crew of 673, medical staff of 489, and other personnel. She was the largest hospital ship ever commissioned, a floating city of mercy, designed to retrieve the broken bodies that trench warfare produced with industrial efficiency. Her maiden voyage as a hospital ship departed Liverpool December 23, 1915, bound for Mudros on the Greek island of Lemnos, then to Naples, and finally to various Mediterranean ports where wounded soldiers waited for evacuation. The journey took 12 days. Britannic performed flawlessly. Her engines ran smoothly. Her new safety features, the raised bulkheads, the double hull, the improved pumps, remained untested because nothing went wrong. She collected 3,000 wounded men from Lemnos and transported them back to Southampton, arriving January 9, 1916. The operation was deemed successful. Britannic completed 2 more voyages in early 1916, February and March, carrying wounded from Gallipoli, Salonika, and other Mediterranean campaigns. Each trip was routine: sail out empty, return full of men with missing limbs, shattered lungs, shell shock, gangrene. The medical staff worked 18-hour shifts. Nurses like Violet Jessup, who had survived Titanic's sinking 4 years earlier, moved between cots, changing dressings, administering morphine, writing letters for soldiers too wounded to hold pens. Jessup had returned to White Star Line service after Titanic, working aboard Olympic until war broke out. She then trained as a Red Cross nurse and volunteered for hospital ship duty. When she learned her assignment was Britannic, she felt a superstitious chill but reported anyway. She needed the work. The war needed nurses. Personal fear seemed indulgent when men were dying by the thousands in French mud. In April 1916, Britannic was temporarily withdrawn from service for minor repairs and repainting. She remained docked until September, when she was recalled for duty. By then, the war had shifted. Germany, frustrated by Britain's naval blockade, had declared unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats were ordered to sink merchant vessels without warning, including those in hospital ship livery. Germany claimed Britain was using hospital ships to transport troops and munitions, a violation of the Hague Convention that justified retaliation. Britain denied the accusations. Both sides presented evidence. Neither was entirely truthful. Britannic resumed service September 1916. Her 4th voyage departed Southampton September 23rd. She collected wounded from Mudros and Naples, returned October 10th. Her 5th voyage departed October 13th, returned November 4th. Each trip was uneventful except for the cargo of suffering men. The ship's safety record remained perfect: no collisions, no mechanical failures, no incidents worth recording in the log beyond routine maintenance. Her 6th voyage began November 12, 1916. Britannic departed Southampton under the command of Captain Charles Bartlett, an experienced White Star captain who'd spent 3 years commanding hospital ships. The crew numbered 673. Medical staff numbered 315 Royal Army Medical Corps personnel and 77 nurses. The ship was empty of patients. This was the outbound leg. They would collect wounded from Mudros, Naples, and Alexandria before returning. The voyage across the Bay of Biscay and through the Strait of Gibraltar proceeded without incident. Britannic entered the Mediterranean November 18th. Captain Bartlett followed standard protocols. Maintain hospital ship markings visible at all times. Illuminate the ship at night so the red crosses could be seen. Sail predetermined routes filed with neutral powers. Avoid suspicious deviations that might suggest military activity. On November 20th, Britannic passed through the Strait of Messina and entered the Aegean Sea. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. The ship maintained a speed of 21 knots, faster than necessary but within her operational capacity. Bartlett wanted to reach Mudros by evening November 21st, load patients quickly, and depart before German submarines could track his position. Speed was survival. At 8:12 a.m. on November 21, 1916, Britannic was sailing through the Key Channel between mainland Greece and the island of Kea. Violet Jessup had just returned from morning mass and was sitting down to breakfast in the nurses' quarters. The sea was calm, the sky was blue, a perfect Mediterranean morning. Then came the explosion. The blast occurred on the starboard side, forward, near the forepeak. Jessup described it as a muffled boom, like a heavy door slamming deep inside the ship. Crew members felt the deck shudder. In the engine rooms, engineers immediately checked for malfunctions. On the bridge, Captain Bartlett ordered an assessment. Reports came back quickly. Flooding in compartments 1, 2, and 3. The watertight doors closed automatically, as designed. The bulkheads held. Britannic's safety features were working exactly as intended. What had caused the explosion remained unclear. 3 theories emerged immediately. Torpedo from a German U-boat, a mine left by German submarines, or an internal explosion caused by sabotage or mechanical failure. Bartlett didn't wait for certainty. He ordered all personnel to boat stations while the ship was still under control. Britannic listed to starboard almost immediately. The flooding was faster than calculations predicted. Water entered not just through the damaged hull, but through open portholes. Nurses and staff had opened them earlier that morning to air out the wards during breakfast. As the ship tilted, seawater poured through dozens of open portholes, accelerating the flood. The design improvements after Titanic hadn't accounted for human behavior on a sunny morning. Captain Bartlett made a decision that seemed logical. He ordered full speed ahead, attempting to beach Britannic on the nearby coast of Kea, less than 3 miles away. If he could ground the ship in shallow water, everyone could be evacuated safely. It was a sound plan. It was also catastrophic. At full speed, water rushed through the breached hull with greater force, flooding additional compartments. The pumps couldn't keep up. Within minutes, it was clear the ship wouldn't reach shore. Bartlett ordered the engine stopped at 8:35 a.m. By then, 6 compartments were flooded. Britannic could survive 6 flooded compartments. That was her design specification, learned from Titanic. But the open portholes had doomed her. At 8:35 a.m., Captain Bartlett gave the order to abandon ship, but 2 lifeboats on the port side had already been launched without authorization. Lifeboat 2 and another boat, witnesses disagreed on which, had been lowered by panicked crew members who didn't wait for orders. This was understandable. Titanic survivors had described the horror of waiting too long, of boats leaving half empty while hundreds remained aboard. No one wanted to repeat that mistake. But Britannic was still moving when the boats hit the water. The ship's massive propellers were still spinning. The physics were simple and brutal. The moving hull created suction that pulled the lifeboats toward the stern. Lifeboat 2 was drawn directly into the port propeller. The 4-bladed screw, 17 feet in diameter, rotating at full speed, chewed through the wooden boat in seconds. Bodies and debris were chopped to pieces. The water turned red. Survivors in other boats heard screaming, then silence. Violet Jessup was in one of the later boats. She'd grabbed her toothbrush. A friend had once told her, "Never undertake another disaster without first making sure of your toothbrush," and rushed to the boat deck. An officer ordered her into a lifeboat. As it was being lowered, she watched Britannic's stern rise higher, the propellers still visible above the waterline, still turning. She realized with horror that her boat was drifting toward them. She jumped, hit the water, felt the suction pulling her under the ship's keel. Her head struck something, metal, wood, she never knew. Pain exploded through her skull. She fought to the surface, gasping, watching as her lifeboat was pulled under the stern, destroyed by the same propellers that had killed the others. She swam away from the ship, away from the propellers, toward another lifeboat that pulled her aboard. Years later, when a doctor examined her for chronic headaches, he discovered she'd sustained a skull fracture. She had no memory of the impact. The body remembers trauma even when the mind cannot. By 8:45 a.m., most of the lifeboats had been successfully launched. Britannic's improved davit system, designed after Titanic, worked efficiently. The ship carried enough boats for everyone aboard. The loading went smoothly. This was what safety regulations were supposed to prevent: mass casualties from insufficient evacuation capacity. And it worked. Most people got off. But the ship was sinking faster than anyone had calculated. Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. Britannic, despite all her improvements, had 55 minutes from explosion to disappearance. The modifications that made her safer, the extended double hull, the raised bulkheads, the improved compartmentalization, also made her heavier. When she flooded faster. The additional weight pulled her down with greater force. At 9 a.m., the bow was completely submerged. The stern rose higher, propellers now fully out of the water, dripping, silent. Men and women in lifeboats watched as the ship they'd been aboard 20 minutes earlier stood nearly vertical against the morning sky. The red crosses on her funnels were clearly visible. The white paint gleamed. She looked pristine, undamaged, except for the impossible angle. At 9:07 a.m., Britannic slipped beneath the surface. Unlike Titanic, she didn't break in half. The hull remained intact as she descended 400 feet to the seabed. The impact with the bottom was violent. The bow buried itself in silt. The stern crumpled. The structure twisted. But she stayed together, a complete ship in a complete grave. The final count, 30 dead. Most had died in the propeller incidents. A few had been trapped below decks when the explosion occurred. Some had jumped and drowned. The vast majority survived. 1,035 people rescued by nearby vessels, including the HMS Scourge and HMS Heroic, which had been escorting Britannic through the Aegean. 30 deaths from a ship carrying over 1,000 people was, by maritime disaster standards, a success. Britannic's safety improvements had worked. The lifeboats saved lives. The raised bulkheads gave people time to evacuate. Everything functioned as designed. And still 30 people died, including nurses who'd volunteered to save lives, crew members doing their jobs, soldiers who'd survived the trenches only to drown in the Aegean. The question of what caused the explosion was never definitively answered. The official inquiry concluded it was likely a mine laid by German submarine U-73, which had been operating in the area in October 1916. Germany denied responsibility, but also didn't deny planting mines in the key channel. They considered it a legitimate war zone. Some survivors insisted they'd seen a torpedo streak toward the ship. Others claimed the explosion came from within, suggesting sabotage. No evidence supported the sabotage theory, but conspiracy flourishes where certainty fails. What's documented is this. On October 26, 1916, U-73 laid a minefield in the key channel. The mines were intended for British warships using the channel to reach Mudros. Britannic, following her filed route, sailed directly through the minefield at 8:12 a.m. on November 21st. One mine detonated. Whether it was triggered by Britannic's magnetic signature or simply by contact with her hull remains unknown. The effect was identical: a hole in the hull, water flooding in, a ship going down. The Hague Convention's protection of hospital ships meant nothing to a drifting mine. The treaty prohibited deliberately attacking medical vessels. It said nothing about mines laid in shipping lanes that hospital ships might use. Germany argued they'd followed the rules. The mines weren't targeted at Britannic specifically, just at military traffic in general. Britain argued that mining known hospital ship routes violated the spirit of the convention. International lawyers debated. The dead remained dead. Violet Jessup was rescued and taken to Aegean, Piraeus, Greece, then transported back to England. She spent 3 years recovering from her injuries, the skull fracture, the leg gash from debris, the psychological trauma of watching 2 ships sink beneath her. In 1920, she returned to work for White Star Line, serving aboard Olympic for the next decade. She refused to describe her survival as luck. She called it obligation. She'd been spared twice when others died, so she owed the world something. She never specified what. Archie Jewell, the lookout who'd survived both Titanic and Britannic, returned to sea as well. In 1917, he was aboard the SS Donegal when it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. This time, there was no lifeboat, no rescue ship, no survival. He drowned along with most of the crew. 3 ships, 3 disasters, 2 survivals. The statistics eventually caught up. Arthur John Priest, a stoker who'd been aboard Olympic during the Hawk collision, Titanic during the sinking, and Britannic when she went down, survived all 3. He also survived the sinking of 2 other ships during the war. He became known as the Unsinkable Stoker, a nickname that bothered him. He'd seen too many die to find any pride in living. He worked in the engine rooms because that's what he knew, not because he was blessed or cursed. When he finally retired in the 1930s, he refused to discuss the ships. The boilers and the dead, he'd had enough of both. While Britannic sank in the Aegean, Olympic was 1,500 miles away, steaming toward New York with a full load of passengers and a reputation for survival that had become her defining feature. When war broke out in August 1914, Olympic continued civilian service for nearly a year. White Star needed the revenue. Britain needed the shipping capacity for troops and supplies, but Olympic size made her expensive to operate as a military transport. Her coal consumption was enormous, 850 tons per crossing, and her capacity, while large, wasn't proportional to her costs. Smaller, more efficient vessels could move troops at better margins. So Olympic kept sailing the North Atlantic, carrying passengers who could afford travel during wartime and weren't deterred by submarine threats. In September 1915, Olympic encountered one of those threats directly. While sailing near the coast of Ireland, she was stalked by German submarine U-20, the same U-boat that had sunk the Lusitania 4 months earlier, killing 1,198 people. The submarine maneuvered for a torpedo shot. Olympic's lookout spotted the periscope. Captain Bertram Hayes ordered evasive maneuvers and full speed. Olympic, despite her size, could still manage 21 knots. U-20 couldn't keep up. The submarine broke off pursuit. Olympic escaped without firing a shot because hospital ships and passenger liners didn't carry weapons. That prohibition was about to change. In October 1915, the Admiralty requisitioned Olympic for military service. She was converted into a troopship, HMT Olympic, His Majesty's transport. Her luxury fittings were stripped or covered. Her public rooms were converted to dormitories. Her holds were modified to carry equipment and supplies. She was painted in dazzle camouflage, geometric patterns of gray, blue, and black, designed to confuse enemy range-finding through periscopes. And she was armed, deck guns fore and aft, capable of engaging surface submarines. The transformation took 3 months. Olympic emerged in January 1916 as a military vessel capable of transporting 5,000 troops per crossing. Her first assignment, ferry Canadian soldiers from Halifax to Liverpool. She made the crossing in winter through submarine zones without incident. The dazzle camouflage worked, or U-boats avoided her because she was armed and enormous. A torpedo might sink her, but not before she radioed for help and returned fire. German submarine commanders preferred easier targets. Olympic's military career was defined by volume and endurance. Between 1916 and 1918, she made dozens of crossings, transporting over 119,000 troops, Canadian, American, and British soldiers, moving toward the Western Front. She sailed alone, too fast for convoy escorts to keep pace, trusting speed and camouflage over protection. The strategy was effective, but dangerous. Every crossing risked interception, every arrival was a small victory. On May 12, 1918, Olympic had her largest victory. She was sailing near the Isles of Scilly, approaching Britain with American troops aboard, when lookouts spotted a surfaced U-boat. The submarine was U-103, running on the surface to recharge batteries, standard procedure when no threats were visible. Olympic's appearance surprised the German crew. They attempted to dive. Olympic altered course and accelerated directly toward them. Captain Hayes made the calculation instantly, ramming speed. Olympic's bow, reinforced and massive, struck U-103 while the submarine was still partially surfaced. The impact tore open U-103's pressure hull, flooded her ballast tanks, and crushed her conning tower. The submarine went down in minutes. All hands lost, 37 German sailors. Olympic sustained minor damage to her bow, scraped paint, dented plates, nothing structural. She continued to Liverpool, offloaded her troops, and was repaired in 3 days. The Admiralty commended Captain Hayes. The crew celebrated. The newspapers called Olympic the only merchant vessel to sink an enemy warship by ramming during the entire war. The nickname Old Reliable spread. A ship that survived collisions, escorted her sisters to death, carried tens of thousands of soldiers, and killed her enemies. But reliability came at a cost no one calculated publicly. Olympic's crew worked under constant threat of torpedo attack. Engine room workers operated in compartments that would flood first if hit. Lookouts scanned for periscopes, knowing they'd be the last to reach lifeboats. Stewards served meals to soldiers who might be dead in 3 weeks. The psychological toll was never measured, never compensated, never acknowledged beyond vague patriotic language about duty and sacrifice. In November 1918, the armistice was signed. The war ended. Olympic continued military service through 1919, repatriating soldiers, bringing Americans home, bringing Canadians home, transporting the living remnants of divisions that had departed full strength. These crossings were quieter. The men aboard had survived. Their friends hadn't. The ship that carried them back was the same one that had carried them over. Nothing had changed except the direction and the cargo of grief. Olympic returned to White Star Line control in 1919 and underwent extensive refitting for civilian service. The dazzle paint was removed. The dormitories were converted back to passenger cabins. The deck guns were removed. She re-entered transatlantic service in June 1920, once again a luxury liner, as if the war had been a temporary diversion from her true purpose. The 1920s were Olympic's golden years. The war was over, prosperity returned, immigration restrictions were still relatively loose, and transatlantic travel boomed. Olympic carried celebrities, business magnates, aristocrats, and immigrants. Charlie Chaplin sailed aboard her. So did the Prince of Wales, Marie Curie, and various Astors and Vanderbilts. The ship was profitable, reliable, and, most importantly, still afloat, which was more than Titanic or Britannic could claim. But ships age, engines wear out, hulls corrode, competition emerges. By 1930, newer vessels, faster, more efficient, more modern, were entering service. Cunard's new ships, German liners recovered from post-war reparations, French luxury vessels. Olympic was still magnificent, but increasingly obsolete. Her coal-fired engines were expensive compared to newer oil-burning designs. Her outdated passenger capacity didn't match modern demand. Her reputation, built on survival, couldn't overcome the economics of operation. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and transatlantic travel collapsed. Passenger numbers plummeted. White Star Line's profits evaporated. Olympic continued service because stopping cost more than sailing, but the margins were unsustainable. In 1934, White Star merged with Cunard, forming Cunard White Star Line. The new company had excess capacity and insufficient passengers. Decisions had to be made. Ships had to go. On May 15, 1934, Olympic struck and sank the Nantucket Lightship in heavy fog off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. 7 of the 11 crew aboard the lightship were killed. Olympic was blamed for the accident: inadequate fog protocols, excessive speed, failure to hear the lightship's warning signals. The inquiry's findings were technically ambiguous but politically clear. Olympic was a liability. She'd survived 43 years without killing anyone directly. Now she has. In January 1935, Cunard White Star Line announced that Olympic would be withdrawn from service and laid up indefinitely. The decision was presented as temporary, pending economic recovery, pending passenger demand, pending better conditions. Everyone understood it was permanent. Olympic was 44 years old, outdated, expensive, and tainted by the Nantucket incident. The company needed newer vessels. The RMS Queen Mary was under construction, a modern liner designed for speed and efficiency. Olympic represented the past. She had to go. Her final commercial crossing departed Southampton on March 27, 1935, bound for New York under Captain Reginald Peel. Among the crew was Frederick Fleet, the lookout who'd spotted the iceberg from Titanic's crow's nest 23 years earlier. Fleet had returned to sea after Titanic, worked various ships, and ended up on Olympic for her final voyage. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate assignment isn't recorded. What's known is that Fleet stood watch as Olympic crossed the Atlantic one last time, scanning for hazards that never appeared. The voyage was uneventful. Olympic arrived in New York on April 5th, departed for Southampton on April 6th, and docked for the final time on April 12th, 1935. She was moved to berth 108 in Southampton and left there, engines cold, crew dismissed, waiting for someone to decide her fate. For 6 months she sat abandoned alongside the Mauretania. Cunard's former record holder, also retired, also waiting. Several proposals emerged. A French syndicate suggested converting Olympic into a floating hotel off the Riviera. The Italian government considered purchasing her for use as a training vessel. Egyptian investors discussed turning her into a luxury cruise ship for Mediterranean tours. None of these plans advanced beyond preliminary negotiations. Olympic required too much maintenance, too many expensive refits, too much capital investment for a ship whose best years were decades past. On September 10, 1935, Olympic was sold to Sir John Jarvis, Member of Parliament for Guildford, for $97,500, roughly 1/8 of her original construction cost. Jarvis immediately resold her to Thomas W. Ward and Sons, shipbreakers based in Jarrow, on the River Tyne in northeast England. The purchase wasn't purely commercial. Jarvis represented Jarrow in Parliament. The town was economically devastated. Unemployment exceeded 70%. Shipyards had closed. Families were starving. Bringing Olympic to Jarrow for scrapping would provide hundreds of jobs, if only temporarily. On October 11, 1935, Olympic left Southampton for the last time under Captain P.R. Vaughan. As she departed, every ship in the harbor sounded their whistles in salute. Olympic responded, lowering her flag. The departure was filmed, photographed, covered by newspapers as the end of an era. She sailed up the English coast, rounded Scotland, and entered the River Tyne on October 13th. Thousands of people lined the ice river banks to watch her arrive. Ships in the harbor sounded their horns. It was a funeral procession for a vessel that hadn't died, only outlived her usefulness. Olympic was moored at Jarrow on October 13, 1935. Captain Vaughan gave the order, "Finished with engines," for the final time. The ship's machinery, which had operated for 24 years across 1.8 million miles, fell silent. The crew disembarked. The ship became an object, a thing, no longer a vessel, but raw material waiting for disassembly. Before scrapping could begin, Olympic's interior fittings were auctioned over 10 days in November 1935. Everything was sold: wood paneling, furniture, light fixtures, carpets, dishes, silverware, artwork. The first-class lounge paneling went to the White Swan Hotel in Alnwick, Northumberland, where it remains today, installed in a dining room where tourists eat, without knowing they're surrounded by Olympic's walls. Other pieces scattered to private collectors, museums, hotels, restaurants. The ship was distributed piece by piece, her identity fragmented into souvenirs and functional objects stripped of context. The dismantling began in December 1935. Workers cut through Olympic's superstructure with torches, removing decks, funnels, masts, lifeboats. The process was methodical and brutal. What had taken 3 years and 15,000 men to build was unmade in months by a few hundred. The work was dangerous: falling metal, unstable structures, toxic fumes from cut steel. At least 2 workers died during the scrapping, their names unrecorded except in local parish records. By mid-1937, Olympic's superstructure was gone. What remained was the lower hull, a massive steel shell sitting in the mud, stripped of everything that had made her recognizable. On September 19, 1937, the hulk was towed to Inverkeithing, Scotland, to Thomas W. Ward's larger scrapping facility for final demolition. The work continued through 1938. By early 1939, nothing remained. Olympic was officially removed from the shipping registry on February 4, 1939. She had ceased to exist, legally and physically. The timing was grimly appropriate. 7 months later, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe plunged into another war. The world that had built Olympic, the Edwardian confidence in progress, the belief that engineering could conquer nature, the certainty that wealth meant safety, had been dying since 1914. Olympic scrapping formalized what everyone already knew: that era was finished. When the scrappers cut into Olympic's hull, they found yard number 400 stamped on steel plates throughout the structure, on bulkheads, frames, brackets, hidden surfaces never meant to be seen. Every piece confirmed her identity. The ship that some conspiracy theorists claimed had been swapped with Titanic was exactly herself, marked and numbered, her identity welded into her bones. The conspiracy theories persisted anyway because people prefer elaborate explanations to simple ones, and because Titanic's fame created a gravitational pull that distorted everything near it, including the truth about her sisters. Olympic had traveled 1.8 million nautical miles, completed 257 round trips across the Atlantic, carried 430,000 commercial passengers, transported 119,000 troops during the war, survived a collision with a warship, multiple submarine encounters, and ramming a U-boat. She'd operated profitably for 2 decades, survived when her sisters didn't, and earned the nickname Old Reliable through sheer endurance. Her reward was dismemberment in a depressed industrial town, her pieces sold to strangers, her steel melted down and repurposed into objects that bore no memory of what they'd been. This is what happens to ships. They're built, they serve, they wear out, they're scrapped. There's no sentiment in steel. The only meaning is what people project onto metal that can't remember or care. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who'd watched for icebergs from Titanic and sailed Olympic's final voyage, worked various ships through the 1930s and 1940s. He never spoke publicly about Titanic until old age, when reporters sought him out for anniversaries and documentaries. He told them about the missing binoculars, the clear night, the iceberg appearing suddenly. He didn't tell them about the nightmares, the guilt of survival, the decades of carrying other people's judgments about what he should have seen sooner. He died by suicide in 1965, alone in his Southampton flat. The note he left didn't mention ships. Violet Jessop died in 1971 at age 83, having outlived all 3 Olympic-class ships by more than 30 years. She spent those decades working aboard other vessels, Olympic until 1930, then various Red Star and Royal Mail liners through the 1940s. She never married, though she had a brief unsuccessful marriage in her late 30s that she rarely discussed. She never had children. She lived alone in a 16th-century thatched cottage in Great Ashfield, Suffolk, surrounded by mementos from her 42 years at sea. Photographs, menus, passenger lists, a toothbrush she'd grabbed during Britannic's sinking, letters from soldiers she'd nursed. In 1934, she wrote a memoir titled Titanic Survivor, though she spent relatively few pages on Titanic itself. Most of the manuscript covered her childhood in Argentina, her family's poverty after her father died, her mother's work as a stewardess, her own decision to follow that path. The Titanic section was brief, almost clinical. She described being ordered into Lifeboat 16, being handed a baby to hold, watching the ship go down, being rescued by Carpathia. No drama, no emotion, just events in sequence. The Britannic section was longer and more detailed, perhaps because fewer people had heard that story, perhaps because the trauma was more recent when she wrote it. The memoir wasn't published during her lifetime. It sat in a drawer for decades, typed pages yellowing, an artifact that interested no one until after she died. In 1997, 26 years after her death, a historian discovered the manuscript and arranged publication. By then, Titanic had become a cultural obsession again. James Cameron's film was released that year, grossing billions, winning Oscars, transforming the disaster into entertainment. Violet's memoir became a footnote to that phenomenon, her actual experiences subsumed into the larger mythology she'd tried to document plainly. What the memoir revealed, inadvertently, was how little drama felt dramatic when you lived through it. Violet described Titanic sinking the way someone might describe a difficult day at work. Things went wrong, people made decisions, some lived and some didn't. Then it was over, and you moved on because stopping wasn't an option. She didn't describe herself as heroic or lucky. She described herself as employed. The same tone characterized her Britannic account. The explosion, the listing ship, the lifeboats, the propellers, all presented as a sequence of problems requiring solutions. Jump from the lifeboat. Swim away from the propellers. Don't panic. Survive. Get rescued. Return to work. The only moment of reflection came when she mentioned her toothbrush, a detail so mundane it became profound. In the midst of a ship sinking, a woman grabs her toothbrush because someone once told her it was practical advice. After Britannic, Violet spent 3 years recovering from her injuries. The skull fracture wasn't discovered until decades later when a doctor x-rayed her head to investigate chronic headaches. She'd been walking around with a fractured skull for years, not knowing, not treating it, just living with pain she assumed was normal. This was typical of her generation. You endured, you worked, you didn't complain. Medical care was expensive. Survival was expected. Only the dead received sympathy. She returned to White Star Line service in 1920, assigned to Olympic. For the next decade, she worked the same routes, served passengers in first and second class, shared quarters with other stewardesses, earned $2.10 per month plus tips. The work was exhausting, 17-hour shifts, constant demands, cramped accommodations. But it was employment, it was stability, it was what she knew. After surviving 2 sinkings, the ordinary hardships of stewardess work seemed manageable. In interviews late in life, Violet was asked repeatedly about luck, fate, divine intervention? How had she survived 3 disasters? She rejected all those framings. She survived because she followed instructions, stayed calm, and happened to be in the right place when lifeboats were loading. Thousands of people survived those disasters. Most of them didn't get asked about cosmic significance because they weren't connected to all 3 ships. Violet's survival wasn't more meaningful than anyone else's. It was just more noticeable. But noticeability has consequences. Violet became the unsinkable stewardess in the press, a label she hated. It turned tragedy into spectacle, survival into achievement, dead colleagues into narrative decoration. She'd worked with stewardesses who drowned on Titanic, nurses who died on Britannic. Their failure to survive wasn't a character flaw. They'd been in the wrong lifeboat, the wrong compartment, the wrong moment. Luck wasn't virtue. Death wasn't justice. Survival wasn't accomplishment. These were outcomes, not judgments. What haunted Violet, though she never used that word, was the baby. On Titanic, an officer had thrust an infant into her arms as Lifeboat 16 was being lowered. She held the baby for 8 hours in the lifeboat, keeping it warm, keeping it quiet. When Carpathia arrived and survivors boarded, a woman rushed at Violet, grabbed the baby, and ran off without a word. Violet never learned the woman's name, never knew if she was the mother or a relative or a stranger. The baby disappeared into history, unnamed, untraced. In her memoir, Violet speculated that the woman had set the baby down on Titanic's deck while fetching something, and when she returned, the baby was gone, taken by an officer trying to fill lifeboats. This might have been true, or the woman might have been escaping without the baby and changed her mind upon seeing it safe. Or Violet might have been handed someone else's baby, and the woman who claimed it was lying. There's no way to know. The baby would be over 100 years old now if it survived childhood. No one has ever come forward, claiming to be that infant. This absence, this person who existed but left no trace, bothered Violet more than the ship's sinking. Ships sank. That was a risk everyone accepted when boarding. But a baby with no name, no record, no confirmed survival or death represented something worse, the erasure of individuals beneath the weight of disaster. The baby became the baby Violet held, a narrative prop, not a person with a life and identity. History doesn't preserve everyone equally. Most people vanish. Violet kept laying hens in her Suffolk cottage after retirement. She maintained a garden. She attended the local church. She was interviewed occasionally by maritime historians, but mostly avoided publicity. When journalists contacted her after the 1958 film A Night to Remember was released, she agreed to a brief interview for Woman magazine, but declined further requests. She had no interest in being a professional survivor, turning trauma into a career. She'd survived. That was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative, dwelling on why she lived when others didn't, led nowhere productive. She died of congestive heart failure on May 5, 1971, at her cottage. The obituaries noted her connection to Titanic and Britannic, but spent more space on her 42-year career as a stewardess. This would have pleased her. She defined herself by her work, not by disasters she hadn't caused or prevented. The ships sank. She kept working. That was the story, not of luck or fate or divine intervention, but of labor continuing after catastrophe, because bills needed paying and work needed doing. Her toothbrush, the one she'd grabbed during Britannic's sinking, was among her possessions when she died. It's unclear what happened to it. Probably thrown away by whoever cleared the cottage, dismissed as junk, not recognized as a relic. Which is fitting. The most important object from a disaster is a toothbrush, because survival requires mundane practicality, not grand gestures. You need clean teeth for the next day. The next day always comes, if you survive. Britannic rests at 37 degrees, 42 minutes, 5 seconds north, 24 degrees, 17 minutes, 2 seconds east, 400 feet below the surface of the Aegean Sea, deeper than recreational divers can reach, but shallow enough for technical diving with proper equipment and permits. The wreck was discovered in 1975 by Jacques Cousteau's expedition team. They filmed the exterior, noted the dazzle paint and red crosses still visible, documented the damage to the hull. Cousteau concluded the cause was likely a mine, based on the location and type of damage. His team didn't enter the wreck, too dangerous, too unstable, too much like disturbing a grave. They filmed, they documented, they left. In the decades since, dozens of expeditions have visited Britannic. Some were scientific, archaeologists mapping the site, engineers studying how the ship failed, historians documenting artifacts. Others were commercial, filmmakers shooting documentaries, recreational divers paying for the thrill of swimming through a famous wreck. The Greek government permits access under strict conditions: no salvage, no removal of human remains, no damage to the structure. These rules are frequently violated, but rarely enforced. Enforcement requires resources Greece doesn't allocate to protecting a British hospital ship that sank a century ago. The wreck is deteriorating. Salt water corrodes steel. Marine organisms colonize surfaces. The structure weakens. Eventually, in 50 years, 100, 200, Britannic will collapse completely, the hull crumbling into an unrecognizable debris field. This is the fate of all shipwrecks. The ocean reclaims them. What survives is not the object, but the documentation: photographs, videos, measurements, dive reports. The wreck becomes data, and data becomes history, and history becomes the story we tell about why it matters. Simon Mills, who purchased the wreck in 1996, spent 20 years funding expeditions focused on documentation rather than salvage. His stated goal was to leave the ship undisturbed while ensuring future generations could study it even after the physical wreck was gone. This was a defensible position, though it didn't address the fundamental question: why does Britannic matter more than the thousands of other ships resting on the seabed? The answer is obvious and uncomfortable. Britannic matters because Titanic matters. She's famous by association, the sister of the most famous shipwreck in history. If Titanic had completed her maiden voyage and operated successfully for decades before being scrapped like Olympic, Britannic's sinking would be a footnote in naval history, mentioned briefly in discussions of WWI mine warfare. But Titanic's disaster created a gravitational field that pulled everything related to the Olympic-class ships into significance. This is how historical memory works. Not every disaster is remembered equally. Not every victim is mourned publicly. Not every ship gets expeditions and documentaries and artifacts in museums. The selection process is arbitrary, driven by narrative appeal rather than objective importance. Britannic killed 30 people, fewer than dozens of other WWI hospital ship sinkings. But she was Titanic's sister, which made her newsworthy then and historically significant now. The 2025 salvage operation that recovered artifacts from Britannic's wreck was presented as archaeology, as preservation, as educational. The artifacts, mechanical components, pieces of the ship's structure, non-human items approved for removal, were destined for museum display. This framing suggested noble purposes, preventing loss of historical material, enabling public education, honoring the ship's memory. What went unmentioned was that museums generate revenue, artifacts attract visitors, and ownership of exclusive Britannic materials grants competitive advantage in the heritage tourism market. None of this is necessarily wrong. Museums need funding. Education requires materials. History must be preserved through physical objects because photographs and documents don't carry the same emotional weight as touching something that was there. But the language used to justify salvage, preservation, education, honor, obscures the transactional reality. Britannic's wreck has economic value because Titanic has cultural value. The artifacts will be displayed because people will pay to see them, not because they're intrinsically more important than artifacts from the thousands of other WWI wrecks no one visits. The 30 people who died on Britannic left families, friends, colleagues who mourned them. Most of those personal connections are gone now. The children and grandchildren have died. The memories have faded. The names have been forgotten, except in genealogical records no one consults. What remains is the ship, which never carried a paying passenger, which existed only as military infrastructure, which sank before fulfilling its intended purpose. Or perhaps Britannic fulfilled exactly the purpose she was meant to serve. She was designed as a luxury liner, but completed as a hospital ship. She transported wounded soldiers, provided medical care, saved lives. She sank while attempting to save more lives. Her improved safety features, the higher bulkheads, the double hull, the additional lifeboats, saved 1,035 people from dying when she went down. The modifications learned from Titanic worked, the system functioned. 30 people died instead of 1,000. This is not consolation for the 30 dead or their families, but it's the mathematics of disaster mitigation. Improvements reduce casualties. They don't eliminate them. Britannic was the safest ship of her class. She still sank. The ocean doesn't care about engineering. Mines don't respect hospital ship conventions. Safety is a statistical probability, not a guarantee. Olympic survived because she was lucky and well-built and operated by competent crews who made correct decisions in critical moments. She also survived because she never hit an iceberg and never sailed through a minefield at the exact wrong time. These factors are equally important and impossible to rank. The narrative that celebrates Olympic's endurance ignores the role of chance. The narrative that mourns Titanic and Britannic's losses ignores the failures of regulation, training, and maintenance that contributed to both sinkings. What the wrecks remember, if objects can be said to remember anything, is not human intention, but physical reality. Titanic's hull split because the steel was brittle in cold water and the rivets failed under stress. Britannic's hull flooded because a mine breached her hull and crew members left portholes open on a sunny morning. Olympic's hull survived because nothing catastrophic struck it in a way that exceeded her structural capacity. These are material facts, not moral judgments. The ships were not lucky or unlucky, heroic or cursed, doomed or blessed. They were constructions of steel and wood and human labor, designed by men working within constraints of physics and economics, operated by crews following procedures written by committees, sailing oceans that followed hydrodynamic laws unchanged by human desires. When the ship sank, water flowed into spaces where air had been, and the vessels descended until the pressure crushed them or the seabed stopped them. When Olympic was scrapped, workers cut her into pieces and melted her into raw materials that became other objects. None of this was personal. None of it was meaningful beyond the meanings humans imposed afterward. The 3 Olympic-class liners were built to dominate transatlantic travel through size and luxury rather than speed. One succeeded for 24 years. One sank on her maiden voyage. One never carried a single paying passenger. The White Star Line, which commissioned them, merged with Cunard in 1934 and effectively ceased to exist. Harland and Wolff, which built them, survives in name but constructs no passenger ships. The era that produced the Olympic class, the confidence that engineering could conquer nature, that wealth could purchase safety, that British industry would dominate global commerce forever, ended somewhere between 1912 and 1939, depending on which collapse you date from. What remains are 2 wrecks on the ocean floor, pieces of a third scattered through hotels and museums, and the stories we tell about why any of it matters. The wrecks are deteriorating, the stories are not. Stories improve with age, gaining detail and emotion that the original events didn't contain. The ships become metaphors for hubris, for resilience, for technological ambition, for class inequality, for whatever lesson the storyteller wants to extract. But if you strip away the metaphors and narrative frameworks, what you're left with is simpler. 3 ships, built by workers who died in obscurity, operated by crews paid inadequate wages, carrying passengers who couldn't have known which ship would survive. The outcome was determined by construction quality, operational decisions, regulatory failures, economic pressures, weather conditions, and random chance in proportions impossible to calculate. The ships are gone. The people are gone. What persists is documentation and interpretation, each generation retelling the story to extract different meanings. This process will continue until the wrecks collapse completely and the documentation becomes the only remaining evidence that the ships existed at all. And then, eventually, the documentation will be lost too. Digital files corrupted, museums closed, interest faded. The ocean will have reclaimed the ships. Time will have reclaimed the memory. What seemed permanent, steel hulls, grand staircases, safety features learned through disaster, will prove as temporary as everything else. The Aegean is very patient. It can wait.